A scary story. A worker in a small provincial town, there lived a guy named Alexei. He worked as a freelancer, doing design for various companies and private clients. His cozy apartment was located on the top floor of an old building, and although the apartment was minimalistic, it had an atmosphere of coziness and tranquility. However, despite the external serenity, Alexei's life was far from ideal. Mind games threw him strange thoughts. Constant night work shifts began to leave traces on his psyche. He also had problems with sleep. Calm night hours were often interrupted by strange sounds coming from neighboring apartments. One day, late at night, when Alexei was working on another project, he heard a strange cracking coming from the corridor. At first, he decided that it was just old pipes or the wind. But soon the cracking turned into footsteps. The steps were approaching, but when Alexei looked out into the corridor, there was no one. Regretting his curiosity, he closed the door and continued working. The events became more and more alarming with each passing day. One day, while he was taking a short break, his computer shut down on its own. Alexei, of course, assumed that it was just an electronics problem, but during the reboot, a strange message appeared on the screen. "I see you." His heart sank. He quickly turned off the computer and tried to calm himself down. Not counting on luck, he went online again to search for information on how to protect himself from the chaos he was facing. He came across a discussion about freelancer shadows. It was said that some freelancers begin to lose touch with reality, and their dark thoughts can materialize in the form of ghosts that they are unprepared to fight. Alexei sat down at the computer again, determined to find the source of his troubles. The wheel of fate began to spin when he discovered an online forum where users shared stories of how they had become victims of their own creations. He read about freelancers who, immersed in their work, created fantastical creatures that then burst into the real world. At first, Alexei was skeptical, but then dark images began to form in his head. Meanwhile, the strange phenomena continued. One day, he saw a silhouette standing by the window. Every time he turned, the figure disappeared, leaving him in a state of anxiety. Eventually, his work suffered. He became more inattentive and unreliable. Clients began to complain, and his income decreased. Alexei turned into a shadow of himself, and instead of fighting the problems, he decided to immerse himself in the understatement of his fantasies, hoping that this would change his reality. On one of these moonlit nights, he sat at the computer, immersed in his work on the project. The idea that had been born in him was interrupted by another strange thought: what if I create something more sinister? This thought did not give him peace, and he remained alone with his monitor until dawn, drawing increasingly creepy images. In the morning, full of fatigue and lack of sleep, he discovered that the computer had completely broken. After that, Alexei's life certainly did not get any better. He began to feel that the shadow of his profession had loosened its grip and was going to take him away. Strange shadows appeared on the walls of his apartment, and the whole environment reminded him of what he himself had created. One day, when he returned home late at night, Alexei felt that someone was watching him. Turning around, he noticed how his own characters, the ones he had once created, were emerging from the darkness. They carried all the anxiety and fear that he himself had put into them. He remembered what he had read: they can be real if you give them power. The freelancer's shadows sought an exit and took his soul for an action. Unable to cope with his fears and visions, Alexei left the apartment in panic, but the universe inside his mind was already shrinking into the abyss. The next morning, neighbors found his lifeless body, surrounded by scribbled drawings and half an unfinished project, which depicted all his fears. Locals whispered about how Alexei became a victim of his own nightmares, which he could not stop. No amount of skillful work or design ideas could return him to the world of real people. He became another warning for those who freelance: sometimes the shadow you create can become an accuser. In the center of a gray city, where neither sounds nor smells came from, lived a young man named Artem. He worked as a freelancer, doing graphic design and website creation. His life seemed ideal: freedom, no boss, the ability to work from anywhere in the world. But, as often happens, freedom came at a price. Artem worked at night, when the streets were empty and the fading noise of the city allowed him to concentrate. His apartment was on the top floor of a dilapidated house. The walls were shabby, and the windows were hung with heavy curtains that did not let in the light. From the outside, the house looked gloomy, but inside there was a quiet atmosphere, soft music and the flickering of the screen. It is difficult to say when exactly it all began, maybe when he started earning a lot, or maybe when he decided to work on a special project, a large web portal for one of his clients. This project became his obsession. Artem spent days and nights at the computer, forgetting about food and sleep. His physical condition was deteriorating, and strange thoughts began to spin in his head. At night, when thunder rumbled and lightning flashed outside the window, Artem noticed that his childhood fears had returned. He had always been afraid of the dark, but since he had immersed himself in work, the fear had returned in a new, eerie form. It constantly seemed as if someone was watching him from the shadows. He tried to ignore his fears, but they became more and more intrusive. One day, when he was working on a project, the computer rebooted itself. The moment the screen lit up again, he saw a message: "You created me, and now I am free." Artem could not believe his eyes. This was the usual effect of fatigue and stress. He closed the window and continued working, convincing himself that it was just a glitch. Several days passed, and his mental state continued to deteriorate. He began to forget about important matters, and his clients began to get nervous. Strange things happened in the apartment. Objects shifted from their places. All sorts of sounds were heard in the deserted corridors. Every night he heard heavy footsteps coming from the kitchen. One day, returning home after a long day at work, Artem found his computer turned on, and a new message appeared on the screen: "You will not escape from me." His heart began to pound. He felt how the air froze, and shadows began to wriggle along the walls. At that moment, he realized that he had created something unusual, something real. With each passing day, his fears grew. He stopped going outside and began ordering food. Artem no longer had the ability to distinguish between reality and fiction. His work began to lead him to the abyss. He could not ignore the fact that his creation had become an ominous shadow that followed him everywhere. One night, he woke up and saw his own projects come to life, standing around his desk and looking at him with empty eye sockets. His drawings, characters and concepts were now real. They had come for him. Artem rushed to the door in horror, but it did not open. He felt cold hands reaching out to him from the darkness. His most insidious fears, which he could never have imagined, were now becoming reality. He remembered the words from a book he had once read: "Create something, and it will live. Just do not forget that it can become dangerous." In a panic, he began to break things, thinking that destroying his creations could rid him of his fears. But with each broken object in the apartment, the evil only grew stronger. It came to life, became more and more unimaginable, and soon real monsters began to appear from the darkness, composed of his fears and experiences. Their eyes glowed in the dark. They laughed and whispered his name, pushing him to madness. He tripped and fell. The moment darkness enveloped him, he realized that salvation was no longer possible. The next day, the neighbors heard screams coming from Artem's apartment. When they opened the door, they found the kitchen full of scattered parts, scraps of paper, and screams that did not stop. But Artem was gone. It seemed he had disappeared into the darkness he had created.